Welcome to the Ashby Village Science and Ideas Group. I'm Joe Evinger, and I help coordinate this group's events with the aid of our co-host and tech expert Hillary Naylor and Sarah Evinger, who will soon introduce today's speaker. All of our members here have varied education and work experience backgrounds, but we all have a common interest in science and new ideas. Currently have over 70 members in our group and another 100 or so who occasionally drop in as guests. We meet via Zoom on the second Thursday of some months, depending on when I can find a speaker, from 3 o'clock until 4:30. We have a different speaker each time who speaks on a topic related to science and ideas. We're not planning a presentation for next month. It's a busy month, December. Sometime next year, we hope to have a biostatistician speak to us. She is currently doing a dementia-related research. We rely on our members to help find our speakers. If any of you personally know someone who might present to us, please introduce them to me via email. Special thanks this time to Carol Kazaya for introducing us to today's speakers. We invite all Ashby Village members to join our group. Others interested in Ashby Village and our presentation are also always welcome. Ashby Village is a 501c3 tax-exempt nonprofit organization. I ask Hillary please to place a link to the Ashby Village website in the chat. To our guest, please consider a donation to Ashby Village or even joining our organization. Check out our website. Sarah Evinger will now introduce today's speaker, Paul Rockett. Sarah.
Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to introduce Paul. He received his Bachelor's of Science in Physics, his Master's in Nuclear Engineering, and his PhD in Nuclear Science from the University of Michigan. His first 20 years of research were devoted to the National Laser Fusion and Magnetic Fusion programs, attempting to harness controlled fusion energy for commercial power production. After a diversion into extreme ultraviolet lithography for chip fabrication, he entered the active area of international nuclear nonproliferation in 1996. The 1990s were a remarkable time of transparent interaction with the Russian nuclear establishment. The Cooperative Threat Reduction Program of 1991 initiated an intimate relationship between the US and Russian nuclear programs to contain the Russian program and limit testing. A separate program took 500 tons of Russian highly enriched uranium and downblended it to low enriched power reactor fuel, which was then purchased by the US government. Dr. Rockett worked on several CTR projects, taking him to the closed nuclear cities in Russia and to the Semipalatinsk nuclear site. He also contributed to several existing nuclear weapons treaties, directly interacting with representatives from Russia, Israel, and China. His past employers included Los Alamos National Laboratory, Sandia National Laboratory in both Albuquerque and Livermore, and Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, as well as an 8-year foray into private industry at KMS Fusion, Inc. His last years at Lawrence Livermore were focused upon warhead monitoring approaches for future versions of the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. Take it away, Paul.
Very good. Thank you very much, Sarah. So I'm Paul Rockett. I'm going to be talking to you today about nuclear nonproliferation, which is an international mechanism for limiting the growth of nuclear weapons worldwide. It's a process that involves a lot of people, often using groups that are set up by the United Nations, and that has, with people that really have the patience of Job. You can come up with an idea, but it may be decades before they're able to implement them because it's just not politically the right time. So I'm going to be speaking for about 20 minutes, and I'll stop and I'll go back and see what questions might have accumulated at that point. Please, if you have a question, just put it in the chat. and then we'll pluck it out. So you won't have to wait till the end of the talk, but I would like to get through some logical set of slides before we start with the questions. In the background that you'll see for me there, it wasn't just arbitrarily chosen. I'm going to drop myself out of this picture for a minute so you can see the background completely. So what you're looking at is an on-site inspection that was conducted in 1988 in what was the USSR then, but what is today kind of Eastern Kazakhstan. And the people in blue are inspectors from the on-site inspection agency in the United States who were inspecting Russian SS-20 missiles, which were short-range missiles that were going to be destroyed as a part of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty that was signed in '87. So this is a business where people really get in your face. They walk up to those missiles, they're allowed to touch them, they have tape measures, they're allowed to measure them, they're allowed to kind of roll them to make sure that they're not fakes. They get up close, and then those missiles were literally sawed in half, as were US version missiles in Europe at the time. So I'm back. Now I'm going to share a screen here that's going to include my slide set. So just take a few seconds here. And let me go to screen share. And then to the slideshow. All right. Hillary, I presume everyone can see this now? All right, I'm going to assume that's the case.
Yes.
As I say, this is the nuclear nonproliferation, the long game, because you have ideas now, but they may be implementable as near as a week away, or maybe not for 20 years away. So let's go back to some of the early work in nuclear nonproliferation. President Eisenhower, some of us may actually remember President Eisenhower, proposed one of the first international nuclear treaties in July of 1955. It was a time when there was a great fear of surprise attack. Both sides had a lot of nuclear weapons that they'd started to build and accumulate. The US side, we probably had a few thousand. The Russians probably had a few hundred at that point. But each side was concerned that these were such powerful weapons. If someone attacked you, you wouldn't even be able to respond. So there was this concern about that first attack. So Eisenhower had this great idea. Here's this guy who'd spent years and years fighting a war. He didn't want to see a war again. And so he came up with an idea that will be described in a little newsreel that I'll show you here. There we go.
The hopes of the world focus on Geneva, scene of the meeting at the summit. Heavy security precautions are put in force at the city's airport in preparation for the arrival of the figures who today control the world's destiny, the leaders of the big four nations. With the arrival of President Eisenhower, representation of the free world is completed. The day of ceremonial welcome nears its end with the arrival of Russia's leaders. Premier Bulganin, strongman Nikita Khrushchev, Red Army head Zhukov, and Foreign Minister Molotov. At the midpoint of the Big Four conference, the general air of goodwill that marked the opening continues. Russia's leaders still show the energetic amiability that has marked their excursions beyond the Iron Curtain, despite a steadfast refusal to make any concessions to President Eisenhower's proposals for agreement on German reunification and European security. The president, in an effort to break the deadlock, made a precedent-shattering proposal, offering to submit a blueprint of America's entire military establishment to Russia, with permission to make authenticating aerial photographs if Russia would do the same.
Now, in the next segment of this, President Eisenhower's volume goes way down. So I'm going to try to crank the volume up, but you may have to go to your own volume on your computers.
If you can relieve the world of the great fear of surprise, devastating attack, then disarmament, in my opinion, will...
So I've cut it a little.
Will follow step by step almost automatically. If you can relieve the world of the great fear of surprise, devastating attack, then disarmament, in my opinion, will follow step by step almost automatically. Now, what we're trying to do then is to relieve this great fear of surprise attacks. So now, our allies and ourselves propose the inspection of all North America north of the Rio Grande and all of Europe in exchange for the same inspectional privileges of Russia and her satellites.
So it may take you a while for that to settle in, but Eisenhower was proposing that the US and the Russia could send aircraft over one another's countries, inspect any part of the country you want, take all the pictures you want, take them back home. They could go over our weapon sites, they could go over our military, they could go over our cities, look at our transportation. This was before satellites, right? Satellites had really just didn't start till early 60s. So it was a huge offer that he was making. But needless to say, Khrushchev, who was the president of Russia at the time, of the USSR, he just didn't trust Eisenhower, and he said, "Net, yet. No, we're not going to do that." But if you just waited a little long, remember I said wait for the right time. In 1992, the Open Skies Treaty was signed by 34 nations and was effective and was in effect during the period from about 2002 to 2020. So this treaty did just what Eisenhower had asked. About more than 95% of the surface of each signatory's country could be photographed from the air. So this, for the Russians, it included all of Europe and the United States. And for the US and Europe, it included all of Russia, which is a massive country. Each side could get 30 to 40 overflight missions permitted each year by each party. So that's, almost 2 flights a month that they could send out. And you only had to give 7 days notice on these flights. So it was hard to hide things. It gave both sides the option to have visible and infrared still photos or to use radar imagery, which showed fence lines better because you could see metal things with the radar. It was a remarkable treaty. It reduced tensions. It gave each side the sense, granted, it was more than 45 years later, but it gave each side the sense that the other wasn't doing anything importune, that it wasn't doing anything that you didn't really know about to get some kind of a military advantage. And why were they so concerned? Well, it was because the global numbers of nuclear warheads had really grown out of control and especially through the 1980s. So the line in blue there is the number of warheads that we had in the US. And so you can see it by about 1963, we had about 32,000 warheads. Stunning number, way overkill. And the Russians tried to catch up, and they more than caught up. And by about the mid 80s, they had, by about 1985, they had like 44,000 warheads. Ha, we got more than you do. I mean, there was a reason for this. Why did they produce all these huge inventories? One was at this early times, these missiles that were flying these warheads didn't have very good target accuracy. So each side assumed they'd have to send like 3 to 5 missiles at one site. So at any given silo that might have had a missile, we'll have to send 5 down there. If we want to destroy some facility, we'll have to send 5 there. But that really doesn't explain the tens of thousands of numbers. There were vulnerable delivery systems. Some of them didn't. A lot of the bombers that were carrying them were subsonic. They were easy to hit. But still, tens of thousands were just too many. So you'll see that there was a cascade. Once Gorbachev became president in the USSR, there was a cascade of treaties that followed to try to address this issue. But what is nuclear nonproliferation, and what's its goal? I'll just take you down before I read it to you. This came from Ambassador Ron Lehman, who worked at Lawrence Livermore Lab when I was there. He was the first director of what was called the U.S. Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, which was set up in 1961, lasted till about 1999. It was an independent agency, and then it was absorbed after 1999 into the State Department. But so Lehman said nuclear nonproliferation is a deliberate action, and that word's important, deliberate action outside of a nation's boundaries that results in quantitative, qualitative, or operational restraints on nuclear weapons, but not just the weapons, also on their means of delivery, but not just delivery, also on their organizations that support them, and lastly, even on the infrastructure and activities that produce or support them. This means that the board that has the things that you want to address include not just the warheads, but all the pieces that take to from building of the warheads to transporting the warheads to mounting the warheads to building the delivery systems. It's pretty broad. And the goal is pretty simple. It's just to achieve international political stability and economic improvement. These non-proliferation agreements offered multiple advantages. They built trust through transparency. So transparency means you're exchanging data. Not only are you confirming you're going to take apart some certain warheads, but you're going to provide data that shows that you really did this. Not only are you going to say that you're going to have control on manufacture, but you're going to allow me into your manufacturing facility so I can see that you're not building more than you say. With all that transparency, you really get to trust one another. And when you talk to inspectors on both sides who were involved in looking at one another's facilities, the trust that you can see, I mean, these people became friends. They became buddies. They would chat together about their families. It was quite impressive. And of course, you can deter an escalation of violence, which was really driving this whole question. But it also increased opportunities for diplomatic solutions because first you're dealing with these treaties at a fairly high level, then you're implementing it at a kind of a mid-level. But there's so many connections that people make along the way that between the trust that you build and the transparency, if any new problem comes along, or if someone says, we didn't address this particular subject, maybe it's time we do that. People are standing right in front of one another. They don't have to call themselves on the phone anymore. The costs are reduced if you have fewer warheads, fewer weapons. Today, we spend in the US $95 billion, $95 billion on our nuclear weapons system. That includes the laboratories that design them, that includes the manufacturers that build them, that includes the transport system, that includes the locations where they sit and stay on the ready all of the time. A lot of money. So if you can cut that down, that's a benefit. It reinforces the principle of the rule of law in war. It took me a long time. I was kind of a lefty early on. I'm still kind of a lefty, I have to admit. But to live within the system and to see that there really are rules by which people fight. And you hope that they obey these rules of law. They go back thousands of years to China in 500 BC, to Horatio Grotius in the middle 1500s, who wrote, how should we fight battles? What's a humane way to fight a battle? And this adds to that. And lastly, something that's not talked about at all is a really important function is that these agreements, when you're in someone else's manufacturing facility, looking at their transport, looking at how they handle their weapons, you're getting a massive amount of intelligence for each side. The Russians are getting intelligence on us when they come here to do inspections. We were getting intelligence on the Russians to do inspections. So the intelligence agencies were just loving this stuff. Let me so I'll say arms control agreements can only be reached, though, when all participants participants believe it's in their best interests. Mandatory arbitration doesn't exist here. There's a group that the UN set up in 1979 in Geneva called the UN Conference on Disarmament. Sometimes it's just called the CD. It meets about 8 months a year. Members from the UN rotate in and out, so there's members from every country there that are represented at one time or another. And if any party or any couple of parties think that they have some potential agreement they would like to discuss, whether it's going to be treaty level or just a handshake between nations, they can come to the CD and they can discuss it in that context. There's records made. It's a place where you can trust that what you say won't leave. This is one of these, whatever is said in Vegas stays in Vegas. Whatever is said at the CD stays in the CD until you finally come out with the final document. It's a powerful organization. So I want to talk about warheads. Some people feel uncomfortable thinking about warheads. I want to show you that they're very real and maybe smaller than you thought they were. So to achieve political stability, non-proliferation really attempts, its end game is to minimize the number of nuclear warheads in the world. Well, then we need to know what a nuclear warhead is, right? So I have two pictures here. On the left, you see a gentleman working on what's called the W-87, which is a warhead that's mounted on the ICBMs. This one actually goes on the Minuteman III, which are in silos all around the northwest part of our country. You can see it's not terribly big. This is just the exterior shell. These are the B in the ICBM is the Intercontinental Ballistic Missile. Ballistic. Well, before I go to ballistic, I'll just talk about because you're going to look at this other picture too. So you see the W-80 for the cruise missile. Look how small that is. I mean, it's remarkably small. The unit on the right has the explosive power. It's about half of what the unit on the left has. The unit on the left has an explosive power that's some 20 times the power of the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima or on Nagasaki. So the bomb on the right has about 10 times the power of what was dropped on Hiroshima or Nagasaki. Just stunningly powerful for such a small package. That's what you're trying to limit. That's what you're trying to say. Are you sure you don't have any more of those sitting around? The ICBM, the B is ballistic. Ballistic means you hit something very hard. It's on a missile, right? The missile shoots it up in the air, and then it lets this thing fly. So only the part you're seeing there, sitting in the orange, that's clamped in the orange device, that conical device, that's what's let fly. And it flies ballistically. It flies just like think of a baseball being hit from a bat. You hit that baseball, all the force you have for a few fractions of a second is the energy is transferred into that ball. It leaves the bat, and then it flies an arc ballistically. The same with these warheads. They'll fly an arc through space, and supposedly you program them well enough so they'll land within a very small distance of targets these days. Cruise missile, of course, flies just above the ground. I don't know exactly how high, but fairly close to the ground, certainly compared to the ICBMs. And so it never has to fly. It has maps in it, and it takes it exactly to the target you want it to go to. Now, nuclear warheads use fissile materials to produce a rapid chain reaction. So the way the bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki was built like this one. It's called an implosion bomb. It has a plutonium exterior. It's fairly small, the size of a basketball, a little bigger. Depends on where it's sitting, what kind of a warhead it is. But think of something about the size of a basketball. It has a plutonium shell, and on the outside of that, although it looks like on the inside in this figure, but on the outside there are explosive that drive it inward, that implode it to its very high density. It implodes it to such a high density that the fissile materials, that is the some of the plutonium atoms just are really unstable, and they just naturally split into two. And when they split into two, they fission and they give off some energy and into some charged particles and some not charged particles. They go to a nearby atom. They hit another atom that splits. That gives off more energy. And if there are enough of these atoms close together, it's called going critical, and that whole thing blows up. So what you're seeing on the left is potentially a 20 kiloton weapon. That's 20,000 tons equivalent of TNT exploding. Now, in the bombs that you saw, or in the housings that you saw in the prior slide, what you saw was that shell on the outside that I have kind of drawn, pointing from the right to the left, that nuclear warhead. Inside that is a case that holds the implosion assembly, and as a primary, because in today's nuclear warheads, you've got two parts. You got this primary, and then you have a secondary. And the secondary has some hydrogen in it, that when the primary goes off, then all the energy is contained within this box that you see there, and it hits the secondary. The secondary similarly is a shell. It implodes and it compresses these gases together. And when you squeeze the hydrogen close enough together, it fuses to form helium. It gives off even more energy than that primary did. And so it gives you like a 10 times boost or a 50 times boost on the amount of energy that you can create. And that's what makes a small volume give massive amounts of energy, like from a small warhead like you saw on the prior slide. That's what we're trying to limit. This is what we're trying to control. So how do you know whether someone brings you a box and they say, here's my warhead? Oh, you can't see it, because if you see it, you know how we designed it. Well, this box gives off some radioactivity. So right up front, you can tell, there's something radioactive inside. It's really heavy because plutonium, uranium, they're pretty heavy materials. There's some explosives in there. Maybe the explosives might have maybe they evaporate a little, and maybe you can sense some explosive gases coming out of it, maybe. Well, although mostly it's sealed pretty well. And then they're really, I can't overemphasize how delicately these are handled. So if you see someone in a military base and they're hauling around something and they're letting it roll off a forklift, it's not a bomb. But if you're seeing someone handle it super gently, maybe that is a bomb. So there's secondary ways to tell what it is. Lastly, I just want to give you a sense. You may have seen this as kids, and I certainly did. But what is this critical business? What is this chain reaction that takes place? And so a critical fission chain reaction is much like 100 mousetraps placed next to one another. So what you're seeing is a lot of ping pong balls set on mousetraps. And when I let it go, one ball is going to drop on it. It's going to set off one mousetrap. It sets off more, set off 16. And even though you see some mousetraps still have ping pong balls on, a lot of energy was released by having all those other ping pong balls released. Those are just like the atoms in plutonium or in this fusion reaction that are taking place, that have a chain reaction that generate a lot of energy. All right. So this, stop that. So let me go on just a little, and then I'll stop and take some questions. There are multiple delivery systems for these strategic warheads. And as you saw up front in the definition of nuclear nonproliferation, we want to limit the number of delivery systems as well as bombs. And in fact, in the early treaties generated with the Russians in the late 80s, we didn't even talk about warheads. We only talked about missiles. We assumed, well, if you have one one half the number of missiles, you don't need twice as many warheads, and you're probably going to take those apart anyway. So limiting these, what kinds of delivery systems are there? Well, we divide them into land-based, and these consist of silo-based Minuteman IIIs. And the silo is this concrete bunker that's built underground that holds this Minuteman III missile that will go off whenever the president turns the right key and says go, if he does, unfortunately. In some other countries, like in China and also in Russia, they use what are called mobile launchers. They do have silo-based missiles, but over the years, they're seen to be much more vulnerable. The accuracies of our warheads are much more accurate than they were 50 years ago. And so it's felt you may likely stop a missile by hitting a silo-based missile base first. But if you had a mobile launcher, you can hide those in the woods. No one will know exactly where they are. It's hard to keep track of them. And then you've got a much more secure missile that you trust won't be blown away. We have them from the air because there are bombers that can drop missiles. Although today's bombers, even the B-2 that we have, and you see the Russian T-160, mostly they don't fly bombs anymore. They're too vulnerable. They might have carried tens of bombs before. They're both supersonic, and mostly they carry guided cruise missiles because they can carry a lot of cruise missiles. They might be able to carry 30 to 50 cruise missiles each, and they can drop those out. So they don't even have to go over the country that they're looking at and worry about being shot down. They can drop their cruise missiles before they get to that country. And then lastly, the most dependable system for all sides are these submarine-based missiles. We have these Ohio-class subs. Each submarine has 20 ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, or a few of the subs have about 150 cruise missiles on them. Chinese have sub-launch missiles. The Russians have sub-launch missiles. They are really the most dependable because they're hard to find. They're easy to keep moving, and they're hard to stop. Okay, let me stop here for a minute and ask if there are any questions to this point.
Yeah, Jesse has a question.
Sure.
Jesse, do you want to ask your question and unmute?
So my question is, why did the open skies end in 2020?
Sorry, I didn't hear the question very well. Hillary, could you repeat it for me?
Well, why did the 2002 to 2020 treaty end in 2020?
Good question. These treaties there's a right time for a treaty for it to start, and for some countries, there's a right time for it to stop. So if the political environment changes, then they stop. So that particular treaty used aircraft to overfly one another's countries. But over that period, from the 90s into the 2000s, satellite imagery became really, really good. And why? While we in the U.S. Felt, yeah, we could get along with satellites, the Russians took a while before they reached that point. And it was the Russians finally just said, we don't want to be overflown anymore. You might see something we don't want you to see. So use your satellites. They're not as broad. We get more warning from a satellite because we know when it's going to overfly us. And they just said, we're pulling out. And so when they said they're pulling out, we pulled out. And you'll see other treaties that start and stop that we'll talk about as coming up.
And Sarah?
So mine's just a follow-up. Why, if Open Skies was developed in 92, was it not implemented till 2002?
there's a massive bureaucracy that goes along with any of these treaties. And it can take anywhere. I see the minimum time I've seen is maybe 1 year. And the maximum time I've seen, that was about one of the longest, that was like, what, 9 years? Or more than that, to go on 10 years. That's right, 92 to 2002. There are, first, there were negotiations on the details. So that a treaty people will go to the CD in Geneva. They'll say, we've got a treaty. And some treaties, they spend years working out the details. How many people are going to be able to come to my inspection? What rank will that be? How do I control that there aren't intelligence people who are coming along? Can I do it in the winter as well in the summer? I mean, real detail. And some of the treaties do that. Other treaties, they just want to get it done quickly. Like with this treaty, like the Open Skies Treaty, they had been thinking about that for 45 years. When the Russians finally said, we're ready to, we just wanted to get the treaty done. But it's still, so they finished the treaty in the CD quickly in 92, but then it took another group, a low-level group, 10 years to work out where can you fly, how do you fly, where's the entry points, where's the exit points. Suppose your plane breaks down in the middle of your flight. Now you're going to land in the middle of my country where you're going to see even more stuff. How many people can I put on your plane when we fly? I mean, it's just a ton of details. And it can take up to 10 years before you work out all those details.
Thank you. Thank you.
I think that's it.
Okay. Back to sharing. All right. So I'm going to talk about an agreement. I've used the word treaties a lot, but you may notice I've also used the word agreement a lot. Agreement's not necessarily a treaty. A treaty is really a government-to-government, high-level discussion, literally between presidents, at minimum between the secretaries of state, maybe the foreign ministries in the other countries. But you don't have to have treaties, which have to be usually approved by your parliament or your Congress, to have an agreement. So one of the most significant agreements came along as what we call a confidence building measure. It's called the Cooperative Threat Reduction Agreement, and it started in 1991, although it had been in discussion between President Bush at the time and President Gorbachev for several years before that. There were ideas at this time. Now, Gorbachev came in and he was like a total opposite of any prior Russian president. He was open. He wanted to be transparent. He thought we were in a bad state. We were at too high a military level on both sides. And Senators Nunn and Richard Lugar that you see on the side, they're a Democrat from Georgia, Lugar, Republican from Indiana. It's never happened these days, huh? They got together and they talked to the foreign ministry in Russia. They talked to some of the lower level labs and the people who were running the Semipalatinsk test sites. And they decided that the Russians were ready to start reducing the facilities, the infrastructure that was being used, and that was as important as trying to reduce the number of warheads. And so they came up with an agreement whose goal was to secure and dismantle any weapons of mass destruction. So that included biological, chemical, as well as nuclear, and their infrastructure, both in the USSR and in the former Soviet Union states, and not here. That was the amazing thing. Not here. The concern from Gorbachev's side is we're collapsing here. You know, societally, financially, we're collapsing. And I saw that physically. When you would travel to Russia, you would go to facilities that had plutonium in it that might be stored for some tests, but a non-trivial amount. And the lock on the door, I'll never forget this. We walked up to this door, big old door in an ancient building. and there was a wire tie, and that was the lock on the building. That was it. So with this agreement, we agreed we will go help you lock up your nuclear stockpiles. And we did. It cost about $400 million. We built a plutonium storage facility in the USSR that we paid for. We had lab-to-lab cooperations between the weapons labs, the Los Alamos and Livermore, Sandia National Lab, lab-to-lab cooperation with the Russian similar labs in Russia. Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus had agreed to return all their nuclear weapons to the USSR, and they held about 25% of Russian ICBMs. Bush had these presidential nuclear initiatives. He said unilaterally, we're going to withdraw ground-launched missiles from Europe and half of our naval nuclear forces. And he said, we're not even going to MIRV missiles. We were putting multiple warheads on missiles. And he said, we're going to take that down to one. Gorbachev, in response, about a month later, said, hey, that's a good idea. Let's also de-alert our nuclear forces. Let's have a one-year moratorium on nuclear testing. This is before anyone even thought of putting a moratorium on the underground testing that was going on at that point. There were no joint agreements signed. There was just a workshop between a working level of foreign ministers and State Department people that managed this agreement. It was quite stunning. Now, similarly, there were decades of piece-by-piece treaties that addressed components of the nonproliferation regime that preceded that cooperative threat reduction agreement. Back in 1963, there were limits placed upon testing, no more testing in the air, in space, and underwater. And that was called the Partial Test Ban Treaty. In 1968, there were limits placed upon those who can have nuclear weapons. I mean, someone had the bright idea, why should we just try to limit the weapons? Let's limit the countries that can have weapons. And who knew if that would go? But it was viable, and it used the International Atomic Energy Agency for on-site inspections to go into anyone who had a nuclear reactor, to go in Japan's nuclear reactors, to go into Australia's nuclear reactor, to verify that they weren't diverting materials that could have been used for weapons. It was pretty intrusive, but still amazing, and it was called the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, sometimes called the NPT. Then in 1987, there were limits placed on the types of missiles. Intermediate range missiles were limited. And not just limited, but they were completely eliminated and destroyed, both on the US and European side, as well as on the Russian side. And lastly, there were limits placed finally in 1996 on the underground testing. That added an international monitoring system with 319 stations and included, this is not just a bilateral between two parties, but it included 187 countries that says we will not allow underground nuclear testings on our land. And this monitoring system was pretty sophisticated. It was set up, as I'll show you in just a little while, to put in seismic sensors and the like to verify remotely that no nuclear testing was going on. And it's what allows us to see when North Korea does a test. So I mentioned that Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the CTBT, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, and what we'll talk about soon, the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. They all use these on-site inspections. So you saw this picture earlier of these individuals at in Saryozek and I say Russian Federation, but it really wasn't. It was the USSR, and it was actually in what's now Kazakhstan. And there it's the winter, it's cold, the wind's blowing, and there they have to be out there doing the exams. These on-site inspections were kind of set up through the State Department, which had something called the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency. They just eventually included that. There's now a non-proliferation organization within the State Department that so far hasn't been destroyed. There's the on-site inspection agency that was developed by the Defense Department. So almost all of these inspectors were military folks who were trained, whose only job is to do inspections. So they're heavily trained people. And then one thing we haven't mentioned is that in addition, both sides, if you have a bilateral agreement or a multilateral agreement, everyone understands that we've all got satellites now, and we can look down and see things to try to give ourselves the same kind of security that that Open Skies Treaty gave us in the early 2000s. And I show a little picture down the bottom. That was in 1962 when President Jack Kennedy inspected what was called a Vela satellite that was being built at Los Alamos. And this satellite looked down to see bright flashes of light that could only be so bright that they could be seen by these satellites. And they would have had to have been either super lightning, but more likely they would have been nuclear blasts if they were tested above ground. In 96, this Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty was opened for signature. So you see there Bill Clinton signing it, but it was never ratified by the US. Same thing happened in Russia. Putin signed it, but it was never approved by the Duma in Russia, and yet everyone goes along with it. So you can have a treaty that you negotiate for years that neither side signs, or neither side, I should say, ratifies, but it's it makes so much sense, everyone just goes along with it. And that's what happens with the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. A lot of these countries, every country that you see here almost has signed it, except for the US and Russia. Ironic. There are a couple other countries. Israel hasn't signed it. Pakistan hasn't signed it. India signed it, but they violated it anyway. They did some underground tests. But it has these monitoring stations which are invaluable all over the world to try to tell if someone tries to cheat. In any treaty, you're always trying to, you can't be perfect, but you try to make sure you've put enough things in place so the other side can't cheat. So these monitoring stations have, I've mentioned seismic detectors. They have radiation detectors if it's somewhat above ground, or if it's below ground, but sometimes there's some gas that escapes. Maybe you can detect that radiation. There's hydroacoustics. Someone could do a test in the ocean, and you might not see it, but the sound travels pretty well in water. And there's something called infrasound. It's very low frequency sound that will travel around the world and can be easily sensed. So with all these sensors, we've just felt confident that they can tell whether there's a nuclear explosion test that's been done. There's this treaty called the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. Now, I'll just read through some of it. I'm going to jump ahead by saying the US-Russian treaty deadline arrived in 2018 when the New START limits had to be and were reached. So first there was a START that you'll see in the lower right-hand corner. Then there was a New START that followed that. The first START, which was called the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, was signed in 1991 and ratified in both countries. And it was just a bilateral treatment between Russia and the United States. And we agreed to reduce the numbers of what were called strategic nuclear weapons, as opposed to tactical nuclear weapons. I'll just talk about that in a moment. So in this Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, once again, they didn't actually talk about the warheads. They only talked about the delivery systems, the missiles. In 2010, they'd gotten down to about 6,000 missiles that were limited by this. Effectively 6,000 nuclear warheads, because under this treaty, both sides agreed to only put one nuclear warhead on every missile for that time duration. But then the New START treaty came along. Its what they call central limits were achieved by 2018. The treaty ended in 21, but was extended to February of 2026. So here's what the treaty did. It agreed that we would have no more, and this is New START. New START actually monitored warheads, finally. We said both sides could not have more than 1,550 warheads on deployed ICBMs or submarine launch missiles or on heavy bombers. That total couldn't exceed 1,550. You couldn't have any more than 700 deployed nuclear-equipped ICBMs in total. So it would allow Now we're allowing for more than one warhead on a missile. And you could only have, it says 800, but it's really 100 non-deployed nuclear clip launchers. So the key number is that first one, 1550. In fact, and we achieved that in 2018. For every warhead that's limited, that's deployed, there's probably a couple behind it. So when you look at the total numbers for each nation's stockpiles, it's around 5,000 right now. Some of those are going to be retired and taken apart. Some of those are backups for what's on the missiles. Some of those are just being modernized. And that's roughly what it takes to sustain the system in not just in our country, but in China as well as in Russia right now. Now, Putin, this is interesting. Putin came to us and requested a 1-year extension until 2027 for continuation of the New START limits. So he thinks it's in his interest. Remember, treaties only work when both sides want them, when they're in their own personal interest. He thinks it's within his interest to limit, to prevent an escalation in producing more weapons, because they're worried about this running away and once again us having thousands and tens of thousands of weapons that we really don't need. So he came and asked for continuation. However, in 22, 5 years ago, he said, with regard to START, we're not going to do on-site inspections anymore. START 1 had on-site inspections where the US went to Russian sub bases, went to Russian missile bases, and Russians came here to ours to go on site and to monitor, to actually count warheads on the top of missiles. And he said, "No, we're not going to do that anymore." But he did do some interesting things. He argued that the sanctions due to the Ukraine war prevented their inspectors from traveling to US. That was pure bull. That was just not true. But he made that statement. And yet at the same time, he continued and increased data exchanges that were going on. So if the Russians do a test, they're supposed to provide what are called telemetry data. What did the arc look like of the missile? How far did it go up before it kicked off its ballistic warhead on the top? A lot of data, and we're getting data from the Russians on their tests, and they're getting data on our tests. And the US believes, the intelligence side believed that the limits really were being observed based on satellite imagery. So that's what you do. These treaties, you'd like to think they're in concrete, but they really need some level of flexibility, so both sides want to continue to have them at some level. Now, nonproliferation worked in this sense, and diplomacy and nonproliferation shrank the stockpile numbers, really increased the stability that ensued. What you're seeing is a declassified official US nuclear stockpile as of 2010. This was released under President Obama. He said, the Russians know these numbers. Why shouldn't the rest of the people in our nation know these numbers? Because we were sending these numbers to the Russians, right? In order to convince them that we were, or not convince them, in order to add information about reducing the warheads according to the START treaties. So again, you can see we were as high as 32,000 in the early 60s. And by 2010, we were down to about 5,000. That number has pretty much stayed the same through 2020. We're still under those same limits, and hopefully we'll stay there or go farther. I mean, at the same time, many people were designing these START treaties. I and friends of ours at Sandia National Labs, at Livermore National Labs in Los Alamos, we were working on START 2, and we were working on START 3. How low could you go? Would the Russians agree to 500 missiles or 500 warheads instead of 1,500 warheads? Was there ever going to be a line to zero? And what does that mean? And they're really interesting and helpful analyses that were done at the time. So we're ready to do that if the Russians ever are ready to do that. Well, when I say we, I'm not so sure about the we anymore, but we have been ready to do that. And these groups that are working on treaties in the Department of Energy and State Department, they are ready. So lastly, I want to talk about another agreement. Iran, this was a different kind of a treaty, right? In 2016, we signed the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. God only knows where they came up with that name. And it demonstrated the use of non-proliferation in an adversarial environment. The purpose was really to ensure the exclusively peaceful nature of Iran's nuclear program, that under no circumstances would Iran ever seek, develop, or acquire any nuclear weapons. That was the hope. And the conditions were that Iran only would produce low enriched uranium for 2 nuclear reactors, that all spent fuel had to be shipped out of Iran to International Atomic Energy Agency sites, that they do no fuel reprocessing for 15 years, and in principle that they cease missile development. The last part, they agreed to, but they never really obeyed. But they were letting the IAE inspectors, who are really knowledgeable people, into every nuclear site that they had, including their enrichment sites, to make measurements, to see what the storage was, to put seals on devices that were very hard to unseal, and to give us a much better confidence that Iran was in fact not diverting materials from their conventional reactors for power into weapons fabrication facilities. That worked until, of course, 2016 or 17. Well, I shouldn't say 2016. About 2020, when we unilaterally pulled out of this agreement, and we stopped sending IAEA inspectors in. In fact, for a while, Iran let IAEA inspectors in, even though there was no formal agreement. They just wanted us to know that they were still trying to meet some of the agreements in this treaty, but they at this point there are no IAEA inspectors. We've bombed the daylights out of their facilities. No one knows if it really helped, and there's a great deal of vagueness and uncertainty. So those are the treaties that are in place. Here's China now is like Russia was to us 30 years ago. They're the real challenge. They're the real opponent, the nuclear opponent. On land, they've got these road mobile launchers. They've got silo-based ICBMs. They have an aircraft, a bomber that flies a hypersonic ballistic missile. That's it underneath the bomber. They have subs just like we do with missiles. They're the real challenge. And I quote from an article that was written by Rogers and Williams in the Center for Strategic and International Studies, a really well tied in group in Washington, a think tank. And they said just about 2 months ago, while Washington is moving slowly, China and Russia are building up their nuclear arsenals at an astounding pace. Years of neglect of delivery systems really leaves the U.S. vulnerable to a better diversified opponent, and now a collective of opponents. And we, under President Trump, are really self-isolated by tariffs, by diminishing alliances, and out-of-date equipment. A lot of our equipment is decades old, if not more. And the U.S. may be more easily dissuaded from foreign interventions as a result of that. So this picture that I show of these are the members. You see Putin standing there in the front. You see President Xi. You see even Kim Jong-un standing there representing the nuclear capabilities in North Korea. So what does the next decade's future look like? The club has grown. We used to have kind of the big five: Russia, France, the US, UK, and China. Now we've got those big five plus India, Pakistan. They have a couple hundred warheads. Israel probably has about 100. North Korea, we don't really know, but maybe about 100. And self-interest should motivate most nations to choose non-proliferation agreements above wars, whether those wars be physical or economic, if they really seek political stability. However, in the era of strongman leaders, instability and vagueness are often seen as advantages, permitting opacity to be used as a strategic tool. So I'm not too encouraged. I'm hoping that the Chinese, they're at about 600 warheads, whereas we at the deployed, as we are the Russians are at about 1,500. They may feel like they have to come up to that 1,500 number, but I'm hoping when they do, which may be in as little as 5, 6, 7 years, that they suddenly see the light and they look for that political stability by bringing us in for discussing agreements. There's a quote that it's kind of disturbing, but I'll still mention it. It's by Erica France and Andrea Kendall Taylor and a fellow named Joseph Wright. This was in the Times in an op-ed entitled "The New Era of the Strongman Rulers is Upon Us." And they say, this wasn't the New York Times. I'm sorry, I misstated that. That was in Foreign Affairs Journal. They said, in a dictator's echo chamber, what looks suicidal to ordinary people can feel like destiny. So hopefully we'll get beyond this transition period and come to a more politically stable time. Until then, we just have to cross our fingers that no one wants to try to use a nuclear weapon. And to date, even in the Ukraine war, Putin seems to be more bluster than he is serious about threatening a potential nuclear exchange just for little old Ukraine. And on that slightly depressing note, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to be that depressing. I thank you for listening, and I'm welcome to take any questions that you might have.
Paul, that was just a wonderful presentation. It was just superb. We have some questions coming up. Martha, would you like me to read would you like to unmute and first and do your question?
Okay, I'm just asking if there are back channel conversations ongoing between people like you who have worked on these treaties before and the experts who understand all this. I mean, boy, I've been active in the peace movement for years, and you just opened gazillion windows to me about things I had no understanding of before. Thank you. And thank you for the work that you've done on this.
Yeah, you're welcome. And answer that, yeah, there's actually an amazing number of interchanges that continue to go on. As well, I was working, so I'm retired, been retired for about 10 years. When I was active in the federal government, I worked in the Department of Energy for a while in their non-proliferation groups, and then at the labs. You'd always hear about kind of low-level exchanges that were going on. Even when we appeared frozen out of discussions, treaties were being put aside. The Russians were testing missiles that were clearly in violation of some treaties. There were still exchanges going on. There were lab-to-lab discussions where the directors of laboratories were talking to one another. And then there are these intermediate, I forget what the jargon is. The State Department actually has a formal category of kind of third-party discussions that are not state to state. They're not low level. They're kind of in between. I was able to participate in one of those with the Chinese. So for years, I'd say, well, actually I have the book here. It's for about the last 30 years, there have been low-level discussions on the annual basis where a group of experts go to China, and where in the next year a group of Chinese experts come here, and we exchange. We have a little conference. People who are doing these analyses will talk about what they're thinking of, where they're going, what the new technology looks like, where that might take us. And the Chinese will say the same thing. I was just stunned. They won't talk about treaties. They won't talk about formal agreements, but it was just an exchange of ideas. And what really surprised me, I remember standing outside of a hotel in Beijing, and I was with a fellow who was leading us, who was a fairly high level guy. And this Chinese guy comes out. He's got a T-shirt on that says Naval Research Laboratory on it. Right? And he sees my buddy who's this high level guy, and he says, "Oh, Ed, yeah, Chin, very good. How you been?" Because there was some other meeting where they were together talking. So yeah, most countries follow that principle of keeping connections going at these times.
Roger, did you want to ask your question?
Right. I wanted to ask about the threat of using nuclear weapons as opposed to actually using them, because I don't really know, but it seems to me that the Russians have sort of a hole card in that sense in their negotiations with the West over Ukraine.
The threat is powerful, and if you don't have nuclear weapons, the threat can be very intimidating. Right? Or if you think that they think you've got more, that the Russians have more powerful weapons or more of them and can overwhelm you even after you attack them, then it impacts your ability to negotiate. So, as I was saying at the very end of the talk, we clearly, and we are admitting up front, we have at some level a not as modernized a system as the Russians have, certainly not as modernized as the Chinese have, because they've only built them recently. And that can affect these negotiations. However, the submarines are the key in all this. It's so hard to know where all the subs are. I think I said there are something like 20 subs, 24 subs out there. The Russians have on the order of that number of subs. The Chinese will shortly probably have somewhere close to that number. Any one of those subs, if you just miss any one of those subs, they can release such massive damage on your country that you have to be suicidal in some sense. And so there's always this worry that the leader of a given country might be suicidal. But otherwise, the threat is powerful. You have to try to balance things as well as you can and keep tensions low by having these sub-state meetings with people on the other side.
So do you subscribe to the MAD doctrine, mutually assured?
Subscribe. I don't know if I would say subscribe. Had I been here around in 1935 and someone told me about that, I would say that's the craziest damn thing I ever thought of. But a lot of people will say, but wait a minute, no one's used them since World War II. No one's used nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
Even India and Pakistan, who have developed them and who really, in many ways, despise one another at a core level, right? These are rabid bigots on each side, right? Muslims versus Hindus. They haven't used them. So there is some logic to mutually assured destruction. And as a result, people haven't used them. But then if you really believe that, you have to ask the corollary question, and that is, so why aren't people reducing their stockpiles? Doesn't the more you have make it more likely that you're going to use them?
Mm-hmm.
And it turns
that
out,
many. You only need a few dozen, right, to put them on all the submarines and
maybe
stuff.
only need a few hundred. For a while, the Chinese only thought you needed a few hundred. And up to about 20 years ago, they weren't trying to build up. There was some decision made in China about 1997, 98, 99. Nah, we got to be an equal member of this team. And so we've just got to boot up. If we want to be they want to be like the US. They want to be the dominating country in the world. And I don't mean just at the state level. You talk the people on the streets, they want to be that too. It's our time. In order to do that, they just felt like they had to beef up their forces.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of the short answer to that.
Okay, thank you.
You're
Paul,
welcome.
Paul, I've got 3 on my list. I just got to ask one of them,
Sure.
and then I'll relinquish. The most serious is cybersecurity. This is something that maybe when you retired 10 years ago wasn't much of a topic. Can you just address how serious is that vis-a-vis this, the nuclear stuff?
It's, it's like another weapon in your toolkit, as some of the more cynical people would describe it. Um, uh, we have biological weapons. We have which are really uncontrollable. That's why no one will probably ever use those. You really have to be suicidal to do that. We have chemical weapons, which have been used in the recent past in Syria,
Vietnam.
and we have nuclear weapons.
But what Paul, I'm sorry to interrupt. I was more interested in, can some cyber attacker somehow set off a missile?
Ah, 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 ah. In my estimate, I would say no. Uh, these are not on the internet. That's the first answer. That's the main. They're not on the internet. Uh, and the things which help cybercrime also help cyber protection. There are the abilities to encrypt signals are so great today that you can have very dependable communications, which you might need between you and a missile as it's rising, uh, or between a bomber dropping something, dropping a cruise missile and getting that cruise missile to go away. Most of these systems, once they're launched, uh, you have very little control over. The information is sent to them. They have a target to go after. And even if you did want to communicate with them, encryption gives you pretty well controlled capabilities. So, and I must admit, I'm like you say, I've been out of it for 10 years. So I'm speaking mostly on my own personal experience with encryption and sending and receiving encrypted information. I don't think that's as much of a concern as you might think. It's more of a concern that someone could shut off the electricity to your facility, right? If somehow you're tied into a power grid, someone might be able to shut off the grid. That's probably as close as they could get to affecting your missile or your mobile missile or your launcher somewhere. But again, it doesn't affect the subs, right? The subs are the answer. They are the keystone in that.
Do we have any other questions?
I just have a comment.
Yeah.
Thank you all for coming. And boy, isn't this tons of food for thought. It reminded me, though, back when I was teaching kids, of a piece that Sting wrote in 1985. I hope the Russians love their children too. And it talked about how we have the same biology. We basically all want peace. I hope the Russians love their children too. And there were even some families, we were part of a group that we exchanged photos of Russian families and with them, just to literally put a face on, we wish these people no harm. And when you're working with kids who are, easily terrified by such, and we had a lot going on in those years, I thought it was kind of interesting that that song was written 40 years ago.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
here we are still.
Yeah, here we are. But your point is well taken. I mean, I would spend weeks, never more than maybe 6 weeks at a time in Russia when I was working there. And I did that over from about 1993 through about 1999, where I'd spend time, I'd work at laboratories there, I'd work on common projects. We would do tabletops, we would simulate treaties, upcoming treaties. Well, how would this one work? Uh, uh, and so you got to know people. You spend that much time, you're invited into their homes. You're not just in conference buildings. Um, you're spending breaks with people, you're sharing jokes. You always had interpreters, so you could really talk quickly to another person. You didn't have to you didn't have to speak Russian. They didn't have to speak English. And I found the Russians in particular were one of the most similar cultures once you got into their homes. A sense of humor was the same, things we valued were the same. It was stunning. Them and the Italians, I find very similar. You can go into an Italian household and it's like you're at home. You could share the same foods, the same thoughts, the same concerns. So yeah, Russians like their children. They love their children just like we do. It's not them that I'm concerned about. It's the people
Yeah.
who lead them, right?
I got Carol.
Carol?
I have a question since it's about science. And clearly there has to be an incredible level of knowledge about history as well as current science related to nonproliferation. And Paul, you talked about the US being sort of behind now. And my concern is that there's less emphasis on young people learning science and sort of what do you see is the future? And people in Congress, clearly there were a few people in Congress many years ago who understood what was going on, and I don't know that that's true now. And sort of what's the status of people's level of knowledge that's required?
It used to be you had that knowledge both in the supporting bureaucracy, Carol,
Right.
as well as in the elected positions. And now you're quite right. There's not only a lack of that experience in the elected positions, there's a disgust with the process, the scientific process that generates that knowledge. So it is of great concern. I have as much, I hadn't, I mean, you make a good point. I hadn't thought about that in Congress. I mean, that knowledge is gone, absolutely gone. Even on the Democrat side, to a large extent, a lot of that knowledge is gone. Certainly on the Republican side, that's not what gets them elected. So until they can impact the bureaucracy, with all these firings that you've seen, you haven't seen a lot of firings in the Department of Energy. You haven't seen any fire, well, except for the leaders in the Department of War now. I recently saw on a website, I was going to look up something with Department of Defense, and it said Department of War, and I thought, oh, that's a mistake. And I thought, oh no, that's not a mistake. At any rate, the leaders may be fired, but the bureaucracy is still there. The parts of the Defense Department, there's a part called the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, DTRA, and they have their on-site inspectors there. They're still training those guys, even though they're not doing inspections now. So they'll be ready to have these inspectors up there. In the Department of Energy, there's a couple of non-proliferation there's a whole department that's just devoted to non-proliferation. It's something called the NNSA, the National Nuclear Security Agency. Half of the NNSA is managing the building of nuclear weapons. The other half is managing the taking apart of the nuclear weapons. It's the non-proliferation organizations. They're still there, and so that information is still there, and that's the good news, because they're the ones that actually go state to state or lab to lab and keep talking with those people across the Atlantic or the Pacific. And in college, that's where I really worry about it.
Exactly. Like, who's coming up?
Right.
Right.
Where's that pipeline of students?
Right.
Yeah,
And
we're
the
cutting
foreign
our nose
exchange
off.
students too.
Yeah, that's right. Foreign exchange, absolutely. So it's hard to understand, and I don't know where that goes. It's not a good picture.
Sorry.
Sorry to ask. Thanks for the question, Carol.
Paul, I'd be interested in what's it like working, I assume you had to work extensively with military on and off.
Yeah.
What's that generally like? Not necessarily just your experience, but in general, how well do civilians get on with military when we're talking about nuclear bombs?
I worked only with actually, there's two groups I worked with. I worked with the military people who were doing the on-site inspections, this Defense Threat Reduction Agency group. And I worked at some level occasionally with military folks on bases. So I would go to a base and we would simulate something, and I would try to see how well you can detect something. Um, and in both cases, they were extraordinarily helpful. On the military bases, they would welcome me in. They would open up a conference the next morning with all the people I'd need to work with and give them the authority to work with me. And then before I leave, there'd be a party and, thanks for being here. They were great. On the on-site inspection side, those people are dedicated to enforcing treaties. I mean, that's their life's business. No treaties, no work. And they're also an awesome group of folks. There's a group in Monterey that's a part of the Navy runs, where they teach a language school, and in 18 months they send people through there who are going to work in Russia in this case, and they come out fluent. And I worked with them, and those folks are really fluent. A year and a half, it's just astounding, because Russian's a pretty tough language. So that's what I feel. They buy into this.
I see, Mark, you have a comment.
Yes, how feasible is it to limit the size of the nuclear club? Like right now, there are, I think you mentioned 7 nations that have nuclear weapons, and how feasible is it to not have any more?
If you don't ask, you don't get, right? So if we did nothing, then maybe Japan would pick up the nuclear weapons. I mean, they've got a great nuclear industry. They got all the knowledge they need. South Koreans could do the same. Other countries, emerging countries, may feel that they need to protect themselves. So the only thing that limits that is the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, which most of these countries have signed, and which provides a degree of diplomatic confidence that that they will have good relations with the other countries inside that treaty. And to go outside of that treaty, they may lose some buddies. And so that might affect trade, it might affect some economics, it might affect finances, and sort of their banking abilities. So there's a few other cudgels out there. But if you didn't have that treaty there, we know what would happen. So if you're asking me, and if we come back in 10 years, will there be more countries? Probably, but my guess would be maybe no more than 2 or 3 more. And even those that did get them, India, Pakistan, they're really pretty bland, vanilla developments. They only they didn't try to develop a secondary kind of bombs. They only developed the primary bomb. They made small devices which could be almost used in an artillery sense. So they've tried to do things which don't encourage others to do what they've done.
Okay. Any other questions?
Do you think it's, I mean, this is off the wall, but what is driving people to want to do this, to want to risk destroying the earth, to want to risk destroying large quantities of people? Are we not teaching them well? Are we not telling them that the Russians love their children? Are we, because all of us here, I know, feel like, we went through the 60s, we've been through all these different wars and stuff, and we still feel like we're banging our heads against the wall as far as showing how to stop it all.
It's 2 answers to that.
Oh, good.
The first is when you try to preventing people from building more has to do with what threats they see and whether they feel that that's the only thing they can do in order to survive as an independent nation. On the other side, for those who have the weapons, it's a question of how many do you need to get to have that what are you doing with it? All you're doing with those nuclear weapons is projecting your power. That's all you're doing. You want some country in Africa to sell you their silver that they're mining rather than someone else. And part of this, you do it because you can say, well, if you do that, we'll protect you if someone threatens to attack you with a nuclear weapon, right? So they use it as a tool to implement their power. But if they had 500 weapons, they'd probably still pretty powerful and able to do that. And I think that's a number people will eventually move down to somewhere between 1,000 and 500. Now let's talk about going to zero, right? There used to be a gang of, I remember, 5 Henry Kissinger and 4 or 5 ex-departments, secretaries of defense and secretaries of state, and they gather together and they say, damn, why are we doing this stupid thing? We should go to zero. We should just get rid of this thing. Well, then people started to sit around and think, okay, if I go down to 500, I can still hit all the targets I want, maybe have a few left over, right? And I can put a lot of them on subs, or maybe I'll just put them all on subs. Who cares with any of this other stuff? Well, then you can go down. Can we go down to 100? Well, if someone does a first strike on me, I might not have anything left. But again, the subs are there, so maybe I'm okay. Well, suppose we get down to 10 weapons. Okay. Well, if you lose a nuclear warhead and you've got 1,000 more, so what? You want to get it back, but it doesn't matter that much, or if you have one less or one more. But if you're down to 10 and you lose one, well, I guess that means the Northwest goes to hell now. I can't protect it. If you get down to 2 weapons, those weapons become incredibly valuable. No one will want to know where you're storing them because everyone's going to be seeking them to try to get a hold of them. And so it becomes more and more difficult the fewer and fewer you have to get rid of them. I mean, it's totally antithetical. It's not what you would have thought about rationally. But when you really start to think about this, it gets really, really difficult. Once we've opened up this Pandora's box, it's a really tough one to put back into. And on the other side, why does a country want to get nuclear weapons? I mean, Japan doesn't want to become nuclearized. South Korea doesn't want that. But if the Chinese keep trying to project their power, they're going to feel they have to. And especially if we pull back like we are now, they'll be forced to do that just to be equal. And that's why finally the Chinese are going to figure it out. And they're going to say, all they have to do is say, God, we got more people than you do. And we'll just do a conventional attack on your island and you're going to be lost, right? Why do they have to use nuclear weapons? But they have to use them now because Chinese have 600 nukes and they just paraded them last summer. How great we are. So I think this non-proliferation power, maybe national power, goes in cycles, right? And we're at a cycle where everyone's trying to build up and pretend how big we are, except for us. And I am hoping that, like in normal environments, 5 years, 10 years down the line, people start to realize, okay, we got a balance now. Let's cool it off. Let's drop back down. That's the best I can hope for. But I don't think we'll put away nuclear weapons. Not in my lifetime, not in yours, not in your kids, probably not in my grandkids.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for entertaining that.
Thank you.
It was very good and thought-provoking.
You're
Before
welcome.
we close things out, we're beginning to impose upon your time,
Yes, we
Paul.
are.
I promised an hour and a half, but I have to ask you a softball question.
Sure.
Now you probably got into this line of work after college. I'm guessing somewhere in the 80s, late 70s.
I got into working in energy systems which utilized nuclear fusion early on. So those of us, there are people all around the country and around the world who are trying to make what happens on the sun happen in a controlled way on the Earth, compressing or getting hydrogen to fuse into helium giving off a lot of energy and running power plants on that.
And the joke is for the last 50 years, it's been 20 years out.
Oh no, it was a 20-year joke. It's always
Yeah.
20 years away.
That's what I meant to say. It's always 20 years out. Excuse me, but
Right. So I already had that background, and I began to realize that this is what we were studying in an unclassified way was what was happening in bombs when they went off. Every time we took a laser and focused it down on a pellet, and that pellet imploded, and we were trying to get that hydrogen gas in that pellet to fuse, we were doing just what you do in a bomb. So when I finally decided in early 90s, I was getting too old. I was in my mid 40s. I didn't want to. It was dangerous for me to be in a lab anymore. I was going to blind myself with a laser. I was going to stick my hand in a pump or something and crush my finger. I don't know. It was not a safe place. So I decided, and I just wanted to do something more people oriented. And it was ironically a time in the early 90s, especially under that cooperative threat reduction program that I described earlier. A lot of money was pouring into the national labs to support that effort. And there were people going to Russia and helping them lock up their nuclear weapons. And, they weren't weapons experts. They were lock experts. Right? They put electronic locks, they put physical locks, they put Jersey barriers up. That's what they did. After talking with those folks a while, I said, hey, that sounds like fun. I want to do that.
it was a loaded question why I asked you that. I was hoping, I am hoping that maybe when you were first getting involved in this in the 80s and 90s, you might have been able to talk to some old timers who might have had opinions on Dr. Strangelove,
Oh,
which was made in 19.
no, wait a minute. We're
That
the
was
old
made
timers that have
65.
Dr. Strangelove.
I know, but you weren't in the field in 1964. I just checked the internet. That came out 60 years ago. So
Yeah, everyone remembers Dr. Strangelove.
what do the old timers in the field think about that movie back? Yeah.
Everyone likes it for the same reason, Joe. It showed us the level that the threat was, really. It showed us how stupid we could be. And it was like that quote that I gave, something that looks sound to a rational person may look mandatory to some leader of a country. I'm sorry, it's just the reverse. Something that looks crazy to us might look sane to a leader. And so that's what it showed us. It showed the fragility of that system to everyone. And I think you see that. You see that in the Hollywood films that we're seeing today. You see that sense of fragility. And I think we all realize how fragile it is. And whenever either we in my business that put the taking apart of the bombs or in the people who are putting them together, they're always thinking about these questions. I can't begin to tell you, there's an entire field of work just in making these weapons safe so that no one, if someone has the bomb right in front of them, they cannot make it blow up. And all kinds of devices that are inside there. So I just showed you the primary and the secondary, but the rest of the inside is just filled with equipment that's designed just to keep people from being able to make it blow up if you're not authorized.
There's something wrong with that picture, though.
Yeah, that's right.
You're protecting it from blowing up so you can have it to blow up when you want to blow it. Yes,
that's right.
okay.
But that's what Joe was pointing at, right? Strangelove was all about that. It was, here this, the Russians put in place this dead hand, which is still rumored about, but Russia put in place this dead hand so that, if someone thought that an explosion went off or there was thought that there was a, oh, right, that's right. It was the B-52s didn't hold their position. That was it. Crazy general comes up and sends them off, right? Here's your authorization. Goes, well, that crazy general can't do that alone. The president has to do that. Hopefully the president is sane and rational and won't do that.
I am so glad you have left up the picture that's behind you, because to me that really stood out. The the idea of the accessibility and trust. There's a level of trust. Yes, that's the one. But just it makes it more real to those of us who never may ever see one of those. But it makes it more real that, you know, it doesn't have to be that big. It doesn't have to be that complicated. I mean, it is complicated, but
Oh, really?
you know, it
It's
just,
simple.
yeah, it's so simple. Yeah.
I mean, what was amazing when you look at the treaty that was used that those guys were inspecting under, this was the INF, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Force, to reduce the ground launch missiles in Europe and in Russia. So they were only minutes apart from one another. The tools were a tape measure. You know, the tools were, you could carry a pad of paper and a tape measure. That was about it. They measured it to see that dimensionally it looked the same. They could push it around to roll it to see that it was heavy. It wasn't, you know, a mock-up. That's all you need. And then you have some big blasted saw that will saw through it. Very simple.
We should let you have the rest of the day off, Paul.
Yes,
But-
definitely. Thank
This
you
is
very much, Paul.
So
for-
fabulous.
welcome.
Thank you so much.
Bravo.
Incredible.
You're quite
Yeah.
welcome. You're quite welcome. Thank you very much.
Okay.
My pleasure.
And all of you have a good evening and a safe Thanksgiving.
And thank you again, Carol and Ray.
And thank you again. Yes.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.